Shalom, this video is about the collapse of the conservative movement of Judaism. There was recently a poll that was released, the first such major poll in 10 years about the American Jewish community, and there was a lot of very bad news about the Jewish community contracting. In fact, Professor Jack Wertheimer of the Jewish Theological Seminary said it's hard to find any good news in this report at all. But I wanted to focus specifically on this in this video on the conservative movement, because it was the dominant movement in the middle part of the 20th century after World War II. There was a huge growth spurt in the conservative movement. The conservative synagogues opening up all over suburbia and represented the bulk of American Jewish life. But they've fallen incredibly fast. In fact, in this survey, only 18% of Jews in America claim to be conservative, and among Jews under 30, it's only 11%. And a lot of that is that because there's such a high rate of intermarriage, that when conservative Jews intermarry, they're more comfortable now being in Reform synagogues. In fact, the article says that's pretty sobering for the conservative movement. Now, they tried to interview a lot of the supposed conservative leaders, like the chancellor of the seminary, the head of the United Synagogue, and both of them tried to put a positive spin on it. We're doing the best we can, and there's a lot of good in the movement. The head of the Rabbinical Assembly didn't speak to them, but obviously there's a lot of very bad things. Jonathan Sarna, professor of Brandeis, had, in my view, a kind of ridiculous response. He said this could be good news. He said, comparing this to the situation of Orthodox Jewry in the 1950s, the Reform movement in the 30s, relative lows precedes large growth, he said. It would be wise to hedge all predictions. It could force the movement into creative reinvention. Hard to see. Now, why is this occurring? Well, first of all, there's larger American trends in religion at stake. The denominations that are in the middle tend to be not growing. There's also sort of a movement towards the unchurched in American religion in general, which would hurt the conservative movement. And George Foote Moore, who was a great professor of religion at Harvard in the early part of the 20th century, said that in every religion there's always been a wide gap between the practice and the theology of the people in the pews, essentially, and the clergy. But it's especially true in the conservative movement. The conservative movement theoretically teaches kashrut, Sabbath observance, adherence to Jewish law, but the survey shows that very few American Jews are interested in dietary law observance, kashrut, observing Jewish law, and therefore the theology and the role modeling of the rabbis simply is so far distant from what the actual Jews in the pews are doing in the conservative movement that the gap is just too hard to breach. Furthermore, the conservative rabbinate does not perform intermarriages, and many of the conservative Jewish kids are intermarrying, and so that is somehow seems to be disillusioning. So that seems to be the larger issue. And I'll just give you examples. I grew up in a conservative day school, went to conservative Jewish summer camp, was ordained as a conservative rabbi. Most of my career served conservative synagogues, and I've seen the local Solomon Schechter become about half of what it was just 15 years ago. The Camp Ramah, when I was a unit head, my unit had over 100 children in my own unit, and now my nephew was a unit head of Ramah of the same age, and there was half the number of kids. And then you look in the Chicago area where I live, there's a couple of very strong conservative synagogues, and there's a Jewish religious community there, people that are pretty observant and care a lot about Jewish living, but they're very few. You go all the way from the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park, all the way up to Wrigley Field, there's a big chunk of no conservative Jewish life, and then from Wrigley Field all the way up to Skokie, Wilmette, there's very little, and there's only probably less than 10,000 Jewish families that even call themselves conservative in the Chicago area if you add up all the synagogue membership of people actually who pay dues right now, and there's 300,000 Jews in Chicago. So that just shows you just one little sample. And my sister lives in New Jersey, says the conservative synagogues are closing up all over New Jersey. So somehow the conservative movement, with basically saying we believe in Jewish law, we believe in Jewish tradition, our services are mostly in Hebrew, and the services are 3 and a half hours long on Saturday, 5.5, 6 hours on holidays. It's not appealing to today's Jews in a significant way. Only 11% of Jews under 30 say that they are conservative. So I hope Professor Sarn is right that it will spark creative reinvention, but it's hard to see. And there are some good pockets, of things happening. I mean, Camp Ramah is very strong, although it's got a lot less kids than it used to. The sound projector system is producing a great quality education, although it's got many less kids than it used to. So that's the major challenge, I think, facing conservative movement.